Recently, a shocking discovery was made near Hitler's former headquarters in Poland. Archaeologists uncovered the skeletons of 3 adults and a child, their remains twisted in mystery. But that was only the beginning. The discovery led investigators to a long-sealed passage, a secret tunnel that had been hidden for 79 years. When it was finally opened, what lay inside was so disturbing that it rewrote everything we thought we knew about Hitler's final secrets. The long-sealed tomb beneath. The spring of 1945 brought the fall of Nazi Germany. Berlin was a city in ruins, under constant bombardment, with Soviet troops pushing closer to the heart of the Third Reich. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler made his final stand. On April 30th, 1945, with artillery shaking the city above, he ended his life inside the Führer bunker. For the Allies, this marked the symbolic death of the regime. For history, it was the beginning of a mystery that would linger for decades. Soviet soldiers were the first to reach the bunker. They reported finding charred remains near the garden above the underground shelter. According to official Soviet accounts, these were the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun, partially burned by loyal aides. To confirm the identity, Soviet investigators later examined fragments of jawbones and dentures. They were carefully compared with dental records kept by Hitler's personal dentist. The match was exact. The Soviets believed they had closed the case. Yet instead of sharing their findings openly, they cremated the remains and scattered the ashes in secret. The bunker itself was left to rot, its rooms sealed, its very existence obscured. Over the next years, efforts to erase the site intensified. The Soviets and later the East German government demolished what was left of the Reich Chancellery. The heavy concrete chambers of the Führer bunker were buried under layers of rubble and soil. New buildings rose above it. Maps of the city were altered so that the location no longer appeared. To a casual visitor walking through Berlin, there was nothing to see, no sign of the place where the Third Reich had taken its last breath. By the late 20th century, the site was almost invisible. Only a small plaque, placed quietly in 2006, now marks a nondescript parking lot surrounded by modern apartments. Tourists pass by without noticing that beneath their feet once stood one of the most infamous places of the 20th century. It was as if Berlin itself had buried the memory in concrete. But memory has a way of refusing to disappear. The silence surrounding the Führer bunker only fueled speculation. Rumors spread that Hitler had not died there at all. Some claimed he escaped through underground tunnels. Others insisted he fled to South America. In the absence of visible proof, myths grew stronger than facts. The very act of sealing the site made it a magnet for conspiracy theories, whispered stories, and shadowy what-ifs. Then in 2024 came a turning point. For the first time in nearly 80 years, researchers were given permission to descend into what remained of the Führer bunker. Armed with modern scanning technology and protective equipment, they carefully documented the subterranean ruins. In their study, they once again confirmed the authenticity of Hitler's dental remains, reinforcing what historians had long concluded. Yet standing inside those crumbling corridors, they realized the place itself told a story that no document could. The silence, the decay, the weight of history pressed into the walls created an atmosphere unlike any other. The Führer bunker had not disappeared. It had simply waited. But why was such an immense structure built in the first place? And what secrets lie locked in its deeply reinforced walls? Let's tell you horrific details. Building a fortress of despair. The story of Hitler's final refuge begins years before the last days of the war. In 1936, as Nazi power grew, engineers began building a shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery. This first structure was called the Vorbunker, or forward bunker. It was a simple underground refuge intended to protect leaders from air raids. At the time, it seemed more like a precaution than a necessity. Yet, as war spread across Europe, Hitler's ambitions grew, and so did his need for security. By 1943, the war had turned against Germany. Cities were in ruins, the Allied bombing campaign intensified, and defeat loomed. Hitler demanded something much stronger than the Vorbunker. Construction began on a second, deeper complex directly beneath it. This would become the Führer bunker, a fortress dug into the ground like a tomb. It lay about 8.5 meters below the garden of the old Reich Chancellery at Wilhelmstrasse 77. The new bunker was far more than a shelter. It was designed to be the last command post of the Nazi state. The structure was engineered with brutal precision. Its roof was nearly 3 meters thick, made entirely of reinforced concrete. Some rooms had walls and ceilings almost 4 meters thick. The lower levels were built beneath the water table of Berlin, so constant drainage and waterproofing systems were required. Pumps ran day and night to keep the chambers dry. Every inch of it was designed to resist collapse, even under the heaviest bombardment. The construction company Hochtief carried out the work under the direction of the Nazi government. Like many of the Third Reich's grand projects, it relied on forced labor. Political prisoners and captured soldiers were forced to dig, pour concrete, and install steel reinforcements. Conditions were harsh and deadly. Workers were beaten, starved, and in some cases executed if they slowed down. The bunker was built in secrecy, but its human cost was carved into every wall. Inside, the layout reflected the paranoia of its owner. There were about 30 small rooms arranged in tight corridors. These included Hitler's private quarters, bedrooms for Eva Braun, guest rooms for high-ranking officials, and a map room where military briefings took place. Other chambers housed generators, air filtration systems, and telephone switchboards. There were even chemical toilets to allow survival if the bunker was cut off from the city above. Despite its grim purpose, the interior was furnished with care. Furniture from the Reich Chancellery was brought underground, along with paintings and personal items to give a sense of comfort. Hitler's study had plastered walls to reduce echoes, creating a sense of isolation. The entire space had no windows, no natural light, only artificial lamps that cast cold shadows across concrete. It was not a home. It was a cage designed to outlast destruction. By early 1945, this underground citadel was ready. The fortress was meant to protect him, but it would soon become his grave. But let's find out what transpired inside when the Third Reich was collapsing around this subterranean citadel. Hitler's final days underground. On the 16th of January, 1945, Adolf Hitler retreated underground. He entered the Führer bunker permanently, a cold labyrinth beneath the Reich Chancellery, determined to fight a war that was already lost. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavy with despair. Hitler held war council meetings in rooms without windows, surrounded by maps covered in arrows that no longer reflected reality. Reports from the front were distorted by propaganda and misinformation. His generals tried to show him that divisions he ordered into battle no longer existed. He screamed at them and accused them of betrayal. Each day he became more isolated, refusing to face the truth that the Third Reich was crumbling. The bunker soon filled with his closest circle. Eva Braun joined him, cheerful on the surface but trapped in the same suffocating confinement. Joseph Goebbels, loyal to the end, moved in with his wife Magda and their 6 children. Martin Bormann took up his post, along with secretaries, aides, and guards. Together, they endured constant air raids and the pounding of Soviet artillery above. Supplies grew thin, food was rationed, and morale collapsed. What had been built as a fortress became a prison, and everyone inside knew the end was near. Amid the chaos, Hitler clung to rituals. On April 29, 1945, he married Eva Braun in a brief midnight ceremony held in a small room deep underground. Witnesses later recalled how oddly quiet it was. No music, no celebration, only the signing of papers as shells shook the walls. Less than 24 hours later, both were dead. Eva Braun swallowed poison. Hitler took a cyanide capsule and pulled the trigger of his pistol. Their bodies were carried up to the garden above, doused in petrol, and set on fire. Flames licked the night sky, but the corpses were only partially burned. The tragedy did not end there. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda murdered their 6 children with poison. Soon after, they too ended their lives. Others followed, choosing suicide over capture. The bunker became a place of silence, filled with smoke, blood, and abandoned belongings. When Soviet troops finally reached the site, they found a scene of chaos. Furniture lay smashed, paper scattered, and walls blackened. Some remains were removed, others destroyed. The Soviets quickly sealed off the site, taking bones, documents, and evidence back to Moscow. What exactly was recovered and what was hidden remains debated. By 1947, East German authorities began removing what was left of the Reich Chancellery above ground. Bulldozers reduced the ruins to rubble. In later years, apartments and parking lots rose where Hitler's last refuge had been. Maps were altered, entrances buried, and the site erased from view. To the public, it seemed to vanish, leaving only rumors and unanswered questions. Hitler's death was not the end. It gave birth to something even darker. A web of silence and suppression. When Soviet troops entered the site in May 1945, they were quick to remove bodies, bones, and personal effects. Documents, letters, and fragments of communications were gathered up and taken away. Officially, this was done to secure evidence of the regime's collapse. In truth, it was also the beginning of a cover that would last for decades. The Soviets knew they had recovered fragments of Hitler's jaw and dentures, enough to confirm his death beyond question. Yet they did not share this proof with the world. Instead, Stalin himself began to suggest that Hitler might have escaped. He voiced this idea not in private, but directly to President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill. Soviet propaganda soon followed, feeding rumors that Hitler had fled to Spain, Argentina, or even Japan. This deliberate ambiguity created confusion everywhere. If the dictator had died in the bunker, why would the Soviets not simply state it? The inconsistencies only deepened suspicion. Some reports spoke of 2 bodies burned in the Reich Chancellery garden. Others claimed that a body double had been used, a man who resembled Hitler but lacked certain features. Soviet newsreels even showed images that fueled speculation about imposters. But when examined carefully, only the dental evidence truly matched Hitler, and that evidence remained hidden in Moscow archives. East Germany carried the silence forward. Once the rubble of the Reich Chancellery was cleared, the government banned all academic study of the Führer bunker. The entrances were sealed, and maps of Berlin were altered, so the layout no longer appeared. There were no guided tours, no museums, not even warning signs. By the 1970s, apartments and government buildings stood over the site, and a plain parking lot stretched across the ground where the Führer bunker once lay. To passers-by, it looked like any ordinary corner of Berlin. Only a small plaque, added much later, gives a faint clue to the history beneath. This policy of erasure had its reasons. East German leaders claimed that allowing the bunker to remain visible might encourage neo-Nazi gatherings. On the surface, the explanation seemed practical, but the secrecy went far beyond what was necessary. Academic inquiries were blocked. Western journalists were denied access. Even local Berliners had no official acknowledgement of the massive structure below their streets. In the shadows of this silence, rumors grew. Construction workers whispered of sealed chambers that did not appear on official blueprints. Some claimed to have glimpsed locked doors behind concrete walls or rooms hastily covered over with rubble. These stories spoke of hidden archives or perhaps bodies never recovered. Though historians remain cautious, the persistence of such tales kept the mystery alive. Whispers of bones, fingerprints, and unmarked graves hinted that something much darker was buried deeper still, an echo waiting in the shadows. The ghosts beneath Berlin. Survivors, guards, and local residents spoke of a heavy dampness that seemed to rise from the ground. Some described the smell of decay drifting up through cracks in the pavement. Others claimed to hear muffled voices, sometimes even screams, echoing in the night. Many dismissed these accounts as imagination, a reflection of the city's trauma. Yet the whispers persisted, passed down quietly as reminders that the past had not entirely been buried. Inside the Führer bunker itself, the ghosts were not only in the mind. When Soviet soldiers and later East German workers first entered the ruins, they found rooms abandoned in haste. Furniture stood broken or overturned. Portraits of German leaders lay shattered on the floor. Maps hung torn from damp walls. The horror of hidden remains is not unique to Berlin. Across Europe, in other Nazi strongholds such as the Wolf's Lair in Poland, recent excavations have revealed skeletal remains too damaged to be identified. In 2024, archaeologists uncovered the skeletons of 3 adults and a child near Hitler's former headquarters there. Their hands and feet were missing, the bones too decayed to tell the full story. Some believe looting or wild animals disturbed the graves. Others see darker explanations. Whatever the cause, these discoveries remind us that the ground beneath old bunkers often hides tragedies that official records never captured. The Führer bunker was never formally excavated in the immediate post-war years, leaving unanswered questions about what might still lie sealed within. Workers in the 1970s told stories of walls covered with scratch marks, as if made by fingernails. Some even spoke of faint words carved into plaster. German terms like verloren, meaning lost, and Gnade, meaning mercy, were said to appear. Whether these details were real or invented, they fed the legend that the bunker itself had absorbed the cries of the dying. Psychologists who study the effects of such places suggest the atmosphere itself can shape the human mind. Spaces filled with trauma often leave behind what one scholar called a psychological imprint. Visitors report disorientation, a feeling of oppression, even hallucinations. The Führer bunker, with its damp concrete, moldy air, and constant hum of water pumps, created an environment where fear grew naturally. In the darkness, imagination filled the silence with screams. For decades, these accounts remained unconfirmed, sealed beneath layers of rubble and denial, yet they were strong enough to haunt generations who walked unknowingly over the site. And so, when a 2024 expedition finally ventured down the shafts, even hardened historians were unprepared for what survival or death had left in stone and plastic. First descent into rot and death. In 2024, after months of negotiation and planning, the first team of researchers prepared to enter what was left of the Führer bunker. The opening they found was narrow, little more than a collapsed shaft hidden beneath a crumbling stretch of pavement near the old Reich Chancellery site. The passage was dangerous. Concrete threatened to give way at any moment, and the stale air inside had not moved for almost 80 years. Before anyone could risk stepping inside, robotic crawlers were sent down, equipped with cameras and chemical sensors. What they revealed was both expected and terrifying. The air was toxic, filled with mold spores and traces of chemicals that lingered from the war years. The walls looked unstable, and pools of stagnant water shimmered in the beam of artificial light. Only after reinforcing the entrance and pumping in fresh air did the first researchers descend. Even then, they wore protective suits and breathing apparatus, aware that the atmosphere could not be trusted. The moment they entered, the smell of mildew and smoke hit them. Every surface seemed damp to the touch. Concrete had cracked under pressure, pipes were corroded, and parts of the floor had collapsed into pools of black water. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the drip of moisture and the echo of their own movements. As they pushed deeper, they began to document what had survived. In some rooms, rusted metal bed frames still stood against the walls. A cracked table held the remains of mess tins, ration cans, and utensils long fused to the surface by rust and mold. Maps with scorch marks clung to the plaster, the faded outlines of Berlin barely visible beneath the decay. One corridor revealed the charred remains of wooden doors, suggesting fire had once licked through the narrow passage. Personal items were scattered like fragments of forgotten lives. The wire frame of broken eyeglasses, a tarnished ring, a child's toy rabbit crushed beneath debris. The physical state of the bunker reflected both time and terror. Concrete had been eaten away by moisture, leaving dark veins running through the walls. Stairwells were blocked by fallen beams. Some chambers seemed deliberately vandalized, as if destroyed in haste before surrender. In other rooms, there were faint chemical traces on the walls and floors. Experts believed these could be remnants of cyanide compounds, supporting accounts that Hitler's inner circle carried poison into the bunker in its final hours. The emotional impact on the researchers was immediate. Some described a feeling of claustrophobia so strong they had to retreat after only a few minutes. Others said they heard faint echoes, as if voices carried through the thick concrete. One historian stood frozen in place, overcome by the oppressive weight of history pressing in on the damp air. Another whispered that the silence felt alive, as though the building itself was listening. Then came the most unsettling discovery. At the deepest point, beyond twisted corridors and collapsed ceilings, stood sealed doors still intact. Behind them, no one knew what remained. Perhaps it was nothing but rubble. Perhaps it was the very rooms where Hitler and his closest companions faced their final moments. Because beyond the rot and ruin lay the final proof, Hitler's last moments frozen in place, evidence that could finally end speculation or open new mysteries no one expected. The evidence, the myths, and the questions that remain. For decades, historians have searched for the final word on Hitler's death. Among the strongest pieces of evidence are fragments of his jaw and dentures, preserved in Soviet custody and later examined by forensic experts. Eyewitnesses from inside the bunker also testified to his suicide, describing the sound of the shot, the smell of poison, and the hurried attempt to burn the bodies. Soviet photographs captured the aftermath, though many images and documents were lost, destroyed, or hidden in archives. Yet despite this evidence, myths have thrived. The most popular is the claim that Hitler escaped. Rumors placed him in Spain, Argentina, or even on a submarine heading toward Japan. Others believed he used a body double in the final hours, a man sacrificed to create the illusion of death while Hitler slipped away through underground tunnels. These theories found fertile ground because of the Soviet refusal to publish clear proof in 1945. Secrecy bred speculation. Over time, conspiracy theories became part of popular culture, repeated in books, documentaries, and even entertainment shows. The claim that Hitler's remains were never found also spread widely. In truth, the dental evidence matched him exactly, but because the remains were later cremated and scattered, there was no full body for the world to see. That gap gave doubters room to argue. The absence of transparency kept the fire of rumor alive for decades. Even today, questions remain. Were all parts of the bunker truly explored by the Soviets? Workers in later years spoke of sealed doors and chambers that did not appear on blueprints. Could archives, correspondence, or even unprocessed remains still lie behind those walls? What exactly happened to Eva Braun's body after the partial cremation? How complete is the record of the Goebbels family and others who perished underground? No one can say with certainty. The secrecy of the Soviets, combined with the passage of time and the destruction of evidence, has left holes in the narrative that may never be filled. The debate goes beyond history. Some argue that exposing every detail could inspire extremist groups who still cling to Nazi symbols. Others believe that suppressing evidence only makes those groups stronger, feeding myths that thrive in silence. There is also the challenge of dark tourism. The site of the bunker is today a simple parking lot with a plaque, but if the underground ruins were opened, how should they be presented? As a memorial to victims of war, or as a morbid attraction for the curious? Historians warn that the way the story is told matters as much as the story itself. The Führer bunker remains both a grave and a question mark. It has yielded fragments of truth, but also given birth to shadows that twist those truths into legend. The bunker has finally spoken, but will the world truly listen? Or let the shadows of history return once more unchecked? What do you think? Please share your thoughts with us in the comments.